present, which I'm going to use to present a relatively early stage paper. And it's going to be an exploratory analysis even as it gets further developed. So this is work with Antonio Glitz and De Carvalho, who's our Brazil expert, Vic Khanna, who's the India expert, Woo-Chan Kim from Korea, and Burçin Yurtoglu from Turkey. And we've been trying in a series of projects to look at corporate governance across major emerging markets, not by creating one index that's meant to cover all countries, but by saying we're going to build country-specific indices with common features. That raises very squarely a problem that is known in other fields as construct validity. Some of you may have heard the term. My experience in the past is some of you may have no idea. What is this term? Okay. So the idea behind construct validity is a measure of corporate governance. A corporate governance index is a construct. We're trying to measure something underlying that we don't observe, right? And therefore we have the question of how well have we observed this latent underlying thing of good corporate governance, which is especially challenging given that we don't really know very much about what good corporate governance is. We have some ideas in some areas. So what is good corporate governance? If we want to measure it creating an index, as we have done and lots of other people have done, what should go into that index? How does that index vary across countries which have different local rules and local institutions? The multi-country indices that are out there basically ignore the country level variation. All that is going to lead to these construct validity questions. Are our proxies for corporate governance any good? And how can we tell, given that we don't know what is good corporate governance? And so this is an effort to explore those questions and see what progress we can make. And you guys can tell me whether the exercise is worthwhile. So our prior research, we've studied the BRIC countries. We avoided, so this is a play on the World Bank BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. We don't study China. We think it's too specialized, so we substitute Korea, and some people add Turkey, so we did as well. What we tried to do is build related corporate governance indices in each country out of broad aspects of corporate governance: board structure, committee structure, disclosure, board procedure, shareholder rights, and since these are mostly firms with controlling shareholders, we're mostly interested in minority shareholder rights, ownership structure, how do they control related party transactions. And then for each of these broad aspects, we try to capture them with sub-indices that are composed of specific governance elements, and we're going to have to use different sub-index elements across countries. In each country, we want the element to be measurable, otherwise it doesn't do us any good. We want it to be meaningful against the background of the local rules and institutions in the judgment of me, but mostly the judgment of the co-author who's the expert in each country, that we think might reflect good governance. So we're going to look at these corporate governance codes, and sometimes we're going to take elements out of them, and sometimes we're going to say, I don't know why they think that's good governance. I don't see why I think it should predict anything. So lots and lots of judgment here. And we also need, if we're going to measure governance across firms in each country, we need variation across firms. A governance element is not useful if it's required by law. It's not element if it's nearly universal. It's not useful if it's too rare. And then we don't want to have the governance elements all be the same, so we want to think about whether two of them are so similar to each other that we only should really count one of them. And it turns out that if you do that, and you try to do that carefully in each country, and you're attending to, we're trying to build these similar sub-indices, the elements that you can use are very, very different. And so let me use Brazil to illustrate the difference in the elements that are usable across countries. So we're going to build these 6 sub-indices. We're going to combine them into an overall index. We're going to normalize them. We're going to add them up. We're going to normalize them again. What's in them? So first, local institutions are very important. Brazil has a unique to Brazil institution of the fiscal board, which is an institution elected by shareholders with specific rights of minority shareholders to directly elect some of the members. It can be permanent in the charter or near permanent elected every year because the shareholders ask for it and they're entitled to have it, that serves many of the functions similar to what we think an audit committee should do in the United States or in Europe. Basically a substitute institution. And what we see in Brazil is audit committees are relatively uncommon. Fiscal boards are much more common. A few firms have both. But on the whole, these are substitutes. We try to build a multi-country index. What do you do with a fiscal board? You can't do anything with it because it only exists in Brazil. But if we build a country-specific index, we can take account of the fiscal board. So out of the 4 countries in this study, Brazil, India, Korea, Turkey, we can't use Russia because we don't have enough detail on what goes into the indices. We borrow them from other people. If we try to compare our board structure indices to Brazil and Korea, having built each one, trying to do the best we can in each country, we have 2 of the 7 elements in Brazil are in the Korea index as well. And you can see that why only 2? Well, 2 others are required in Korea. They're of no use in building an index. Data on whether the CEO is a board chairman is not available in Korea. Data on the fiscal board is not meaningful in Korea. Compensation committee exists. Those are elements of the Korea index, but they're rare in Brazil. There's no point in including a measure that nobody uses. So we end up with only 2 out of 7 common elements. Let me look at one more of our 6 sub-indices. So this is for board procedure, and you can't read this. That's fine. You can't read what the elements are. I don't care. The point is, in Brazil and India, where we use our own surveys to try to get at information about board procedure, we get reasonable overlap because the surveys are similar. We can ask similar questions. In India, much of the information is public. That's an X. In Brazil, almost none of it is public. That's an NP for not public. Let's take those 2 countries where we use our own indices and see what we can measure in Korea and Turkey, and the answer is there's almost no overlap. You just can't use the same elements. And if you try to use elements that are public, well, you have nothing at all, right? I mean, there's nothing left. So you can't go across many countries and rely on public elements. The data just isn't there. You have to build different sub-indices in different countries, or you get nothing. And of course, this is 2 countries. The problem is, or 4 countries. The problem would get worse if you tried to get more. This is going to raise severe construct validity questions. Right? We're not sure how to measure governance. We're not sure what counts as good for which firms in which countries. We don't think that one size fits all. We have different overall indices in each country. We have different sub-indices. In some of these countries, we can't even measure all 6 of the sub-indices because we don't have data. And as you've seen, we have very different sub-index elements in each country. And then we're going to hope that these sub-indices and then the overall indices that we build are proxying for similar things in different countries, right? And we're going to find in each of the countries that we can predict Tobin's Q. That's useful. That's interesting. We're going to look at which sub-indices predict Tobin's Q. And we're hoping that these are proxying for similar concepts. What gives us some basis for such a hope? Okay, we can ask, right? Does governance predict firm value? Proxy by Tobin's Q or something else. As CGI as a whole, particular sub-indices, we do that in other work. But suppose we don't find an effect, as we don't for some of the sub-indices. We find an effect especially for disclosure and to a lesser extent for board structure and very little else. Maybe that aspect of governance doesn't predict firm value, or maybe we've just done a bad job of measuring it. It really would if we could measure it better. We have no way of knowing. So a negative result when we're predicting an economic outcome doesn't tell us whether we've got a good construct. Similarly, a positive result, we do find prediction of a relevant outcome, might mean we've picked a good construct, but it might mean we've picked a bad construct and we're really proxying for something else other than what we think we're proxying for. And then, of course, we have the usual endogeneity concerns about omitted variable bias and so on. So in any effort to build a corporate governance index, and there are lots of them, and we're not alone in doing this, construct validity is a hard problem, and the solution in almost all of the literature has been simply to ignore it and build the index anyway and hope for the best. And there are no easy solutions, and so this is only going to be an exploratory study on which we hope to make some progress by asking, if we take the problem seriously, how much can we learn about whether we have good constructs or not? And you'll see that we can learn something, but maybe not as much as we hope. So what would you want to do? Well, first, you would better build your elements and sub-indices first, the design stage of your analysis, as Don Rubin calls it. If you try to aim directly for high scores on measures of construct validity, you will succeed, but you will have no idea whether what you've done is meaningful. The tests for validity, such as they are, will become entirely meaningless. So we build the elements and the sub-indices first, and separately. We're not directly aiming at measures of construct validity. Once we do that, we can then look at a couple of measures. What would we hope for if we thought we had good construct validity? We'd hope for some correlation across sub-indices. It would be odd if firms that were good on one measure were that was unrelated to how they performed on other aspects of governance. The standard measure of construct validity in the education and psych literature is Cronbach Alpha. It's a crude measure, but as we'll see, it turns out that while a low score is problematic, a really high score is problematic too, which is not something that is recognized in the education or psych literatures. They seem to think that higher score is better. And I'm going to explain why that is. We're going to want reasonable inter-element correlation among the elements of the sub-index or of the overall governance index. But if the correlation is too high, it probably means we've chosen bad elements. We were trying not to pick two elements that did the same thing. It would be really easy to get a high score by picking 10 elements that all measure exactly the same thing. And the Cronbach Alpha is a measure of correlation. They will correlate. We will get a high Cronbach Alpha. That doesn't mean we've actually captured the underlying construct very well. So we need reasonable correlation. Then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to perform principal component analyses. What those do are basically they take the correlation matrix among the elements and build eigenvectors and ask what's the eigenvector with the highest eigenvalue. That's the first principal component. What's the orthogonal eigenvector with the second highest orthogonal eigenvector with the second highest eigenvalue? That's the second principal component, and so on. And these are efforts to make some coherent sense out of a multidimensional space, where the coherence and the relationships among the elements may not be immediately apparent. And then we're going to see whether those principal components seem to map onto our sub-indices, which might suggest that the sub-indices have some coherence to them. So that's the strategy. Let me start with the correlations between sub-indices. We'd be troubled if they were all close to zero. So let me explain what each of these is with Brazil. So each sub-index is part of the overall index. It will therefore correlate with the overall index mechanically. That's not interesting. So what we do instead in the top line is ask whether each sub-index correlates with the rest of the governance index with a sub-index complement. And you can see for Brazil that we get positive correlation, not super high. That's actually good, except for control of related party transactions. That seems to be positive but small correlations, largely independent of anything else. That might be a warning sign that our measure of control over RPTs isn't that good a measure at all, or it might just mean that how firms behave for this aspect of governance isn't closely related. We can't tell. For India, shareholder rights, you're going to see is very loosely correlated with other things, and we're going to see that becomes problematic later. But right now, the low correlations are a warning sign that maybe we don't have such a good construct. Korea, ownership structure is negatively correlated with the other sub-indices. That's interesting, makes you worry about, do you have a good measure of the ownership aspect of governance. In Turkey, the same thing. Ownership is weakly correlated with other things. This is a different way of looking at the correlations between elements. What we hope for is that they tilt to positive, but they're not too high. So this is actually a pretty good chart for us. It would be surprising if they were all positive, That would be, given that we would design them looking at the correlations. It would be troubling if we didn't, on the whole, have a positive correlation. And so for Brazil, we tend to have small positive correlations, and we view that as a positive sign. Okay, here's Cronbach alpha, right? The definition is really simple. Let's take the number of elements, multiply by the mean inter-element correlation, and divide by 1 plus n minus 1 over r. And you're going to observe very quickly that if you have a large number of elements, you can get a high Cronbach alpha even if the correlation is relatively small. So if you're doing a test in education or psychology and you want to have lots and lots of questions. Well, we don't have lots and lots of questions. We only have so many aspects of governance that we think we can measure and are similar. So our n is going to be limited. And then r is this mean correlation among elements. But I've suggested to you that it's kind of a spurious measure, right? You'd be worried if the elements don't correlate at all. But you'd be worried if they correlate too much, because then you're just measuring the same thing. Right? I can ask my kid, how much is 2 plus 2? And he gives me an answer. How much is 1 plus 3? He gives me an answer. Okay, I learned something about whether he knows about single-digit addition. I don't learn so much about whether he understands math. Right? If the questions are too similar, the answers will be highly correlated. That's not necessarily good. So the right R, the right mean inter-element correlation, is probably somewhere in the middle. So what do we get? We look at Cronbach alpha across all governance elements in all 4 countries, and you see rules of thumb in the education and psych literature of 0.6 or better is good, or 0.7 or better is good. Where these come from, we can't figure out, quite frankly, but certainly if you're really low, it's probably a bad sign. But by those measures, our overall indices are looking pretty good in all 4 countries, and then particular sub-indices, we're getting some fairly high measures of Cronbach alpha against the background of our inter-element correlations are not so high that those are driving Cronbach alpha. On the other hand, let's look at shareholder rights in India, which we saw didn't correlate very well with the rest of governance. It's got a really lousy Cronbach alpha. That's going to be a warning sign that whatever we think minority shareholder rights might be, we're not doing a good job of measuring it in India. We ought not to pay much attention to those results. Maybe we ought to go back to the drawing board and find a better index if we knew how. But we shouldn't expect much out of there. So this I've talked about why we should worry if the R is too high. No theory on how much is high enough, right? Again, the literature is higher is better, but it's easy to get higher alpha just by having higher N, and that can lead you to search for bad elements, or having higher R by having many similar elements. So the second thing we can do is we can run this principal component analysis, and we'll do it using what's called Varimax notation. There's a rule of thumb that loadings greater than 0.4 are the main loadings of a particular element. And so we can do this both at the sub-index level and at the element level, and I'll show you this for Turkey as an example. And at the sub-index level, the first principal component loads on disclosure and board structure and board procedure, and not the other 2 sub-indices that we can measure. That's interesting. That's some evidence of coherence. And then the second principal component loads on the 2 that weren't in the first principal component. Then if we go down to the element level, the first principal component loads heavily on disclosure. If we count the elements with weightings, loadings over 0.4, they're all within disclosure index, and their mean loadings are quite high at 0.81. Second principal component is all board structure. The third principal component is back to disclosure, but 4 different elements of disclosure. We look at this as a positive sign that our measures are coherent in the sense that elements that correlate together are being placed within the same sub-indices. So this would be a sign of more coherence in our measure. That's as far as we know how to get, given the state of the construct validity literature as it exists. And I'm going to turn it over to Yishai to tell me why all of this is a piece of something.
Okay, so I'm going to depart from the standard practice of discussing papers. Rather than a summary and then some comments, I'm going to mix the 2. Describe a little bit what Bernie and his co-authors are doing, and then in between interject or interfere with some comments. And then the more serious fundamental issues that bother me about this approach will come later. Even the thank you to the organizers and all that stuff will come at the end. So let me start with, I did not understand, as Bernie had anticipated, I did not understand the term construct validity. And so I would like to start with alternative titles. The first one is Bernie finally getting old? Revisiting the old corporate governance indices literature to which Bernie and his co-authors have been major contributors. The second one may be more scientific, the art of constructing corporate governance indices. The science is in with a question mark. This approach of constructing corporate governance indices has a lot of merit, a lot of things going for it, but is also associated with major conceptual and other concerns, empirical. The paper tries to address a few of those. I am not sure these are the most important ones, at least to me, and that's basically what I'm going to talk about. So here is how Bernie and his co-authors go about constructing these international corporate governance indices. First, they ask, are certain concepts used in different countries, like board independence or disclosure or what have you? They do not really ask whether the meaning is identical. So is it the same to be an independent director in China is not in the sample, but say China and Turkey? This is a little bit like if some of you have used this World Value Survey measures of culture or cultural distance. So they actually struggle with this. Say if you ask in different cultural concepts about, I don't know, abortions, is it the same meaning when you ask about abortion in China or when you ask about abortion in Italy? So they actually don't do this here. They don't ask whether board independence is the same. They ask whether or not these constructs exist in different countries. Then they ask, as Bernie has explained, whether or not there is variation across firms in this measure, otherwise you cannot use it. And much of the paper and much of the presentation have focused on whether or not different variables within a sub-index are somehow related, whether they say disclosure, whether they measure the same thing, and then are they aggregated in a reasonable way using the principal components. I'm not perfectly certain they should measure the same thing, and I'll come back to this. I would actually like them to measure different things. Okay, and then, so once they constructed these indices, they come up with some measures to evaluate them. The first one is this Cronbach Alpha. I only knew about, our alpha, so that's a novelty. In any case, so they check whether the subcomponents of an index are correlated according to this measure, and they claim that it shouldn't be too high and shouldn't be too low. I think the interesting question behind this is not the mechanical level of correlation, but whether or not different indices or different components of an indices are substitutes of or complements. So the economics behind this is really missing. I would like some of them to be complements, so maybe they go together and might even have a high Cronbach or whatever other alpha, right? But some of them may be substitutes, and it would be interesting to know why in some countries or some contexts, two different sub-indices go together or replace each other. Then they go through the exercise of this Pca aggregation. I never got the eigenvalues, not even in graduate school, but I understand the concept. I'm not sure here what is the purpose of the Pca analysis. Is the objective to circumvent some of the major weaknesses of these indices, and something that Bernie has not talked about, the binary nature of these indices? They're all based on yes or no questions and the equal weights. Or if there is any other sort of economic objective to this exercise. And then finally, Bernie didn't show this because he was afraid that Steve Kaplan might say something. Then they ask whether or not the constructs are correlated with Q. So I have to confess I discussed the paper by Bernie last year at the conference, corporate governance conference. this is copied from there, so it's not because Steve say, I did not understand whether or not they should be correlated with Q, and I'll come back to this in a minute. And then here are the results with some more quibbles. So the soft impression that Bernie and his co-authors have is that this Cronbach Alpha is more or less okay. It's not too high, it's not too low. PCAs, they report for different countries, different indices. They are sort of satisfied with the results. I'm not perfectly certain, perhaps it's my lack of understanding, that this is the best way to show that these indices or sub-indices or components actually matter. And then they report a positive correlation with Q, which leaves me, leaving aside the issues that Steve and others have with Q, why is disclosure more important in one country and board independencies in another? Is it because of a statistical reason, there is not enough variation in one of these in one country, or is it because the economic substance is different? So I'm going to come to this, but for example, you understand the theme of the missing theory behind this. For example, disclosure, according to the Laporta et al. Literature, works with private enforcement. So you disclose, and then whoever is ripped off can go to court. So maybe disclosure is not enough if you don't have these liability standards and what have you. And maybe disclosure is not enough in some context because there isn't enough variation. So I would really like to know these things. Now I'm moving from the inserted red quibbles to the serious stuff. I think it's serious stuff, you'll decide. So let me start with the Q. Unfortunately, I didn't plan it this way. So, I did plan it this way before I knew of yesterday's discussion. So what is the point of linking indices or sub-indices or their components to Q? Is it to show that the index is reasonable? That's fine. So these constructs are sort of correlated with something that we sort of believe is good. Or is it, if the purpose is instead to say that certain corporate governance features actually cause or bring about improved performance with policy implications? So if you disclose more, you will perform better. This requires a totally different standard of empirical proof. I would actually sort of push Bernie to decide which way they want to go with this part. There is also the issue of these links between corporate governance measures and Q have been around in Bernie's work for country-specific things, at the group level, at the firm level, and so on. And so you want to know, in what sense this part of this analysis is novel, and then, of course, why Q? I want to go to the stuff that I'm really troubled by. This the industry, or many studies based on these corporate governance indices, right? So the beginning, the Bible or the prophets, right? Gomper's ECGI metric. That is a classic. That is a classic because A, because they came up with the concept, and B, because they make a serious, gallant attempt to separate causality from sample selection, from omitted variables. It's a very nicely done paper. Then there is the Bebchuk refinement. I want to confess, 10 years ago at the inaugural ECGI meeting in Oxford, I had to discuss this, the Bebchuk paper. I didn't see the beauty of it then. I still don't, 10 years later. But then came Bernie and his co-author. They have made a major contribution in transforming the GIM index, which is suitable for American dispersely held companies, to emerging markets, controlling shareholders, and that has been a very important contribution. And the real issue is what next, right? So where is this literature going? What insights can be inferred from further refinements of these indices? So my personal inclination is that the next stage, rather than a statistical or mechanical improvement of these indices, is to try and get at the interesting economic questions which are behind it. So here are some that I like, but of course Bernie may like others. What is the relationship between country level and firm level or company level corporate governance measures? Are they complements or substitutes? Is disclosure at the firm level a replacement for weak disclosure rules at the country level, and so on? I have already alluded to this. Why do some corporate governance components work in some cases but not in others? Why the boards, I don't remember now, work in, say, Turkey and disclosure in Korea or vice versa? The story or the theory is missing. So on disclosure, I've already said this. We have some sort of theory on boards. Some people here have done a lot of work on boards. Maybe they can say something about the environment or context in which this would work. All of this industry of corporate governance indices is based on the assumption that the constructs are independent. So you score, like you get a score for board independence, you get a score on disclosure or related party transactions or what have you. I'm sorry. But some of these components are correlated, right? So you can imagine a story whereby board structure determines disclosure. This would be interesting economically and would also affect the statistical relation between these index component, which is what this paper is after, right? I'm sort of missing maybe it will come next, the economic discussion of the issues rather than the statistical or mechanical discussion of the constructs. I'm getting close to the end. I have 2 slides called in sum. So I am all for examining the corporate governance indices. I would have had more fun if the next stage in this research would have been a discussion of the fundamental economic concepts behind these measures, but there is an alternative which is perfectly legitimate to check the robustness of the existing constructs, and I think this is what this paper is currently aimed at. I personally find this less exciting, which doesn't mean that it's not a valid exercise. I would also be interested in somehow, delving deeper into the fundamental cross-country differences in corporate governance, rather than just, again, saying that whatever board structure works in Turkey and disclosure in Korea or vice versa. It would be really interesting to know why, and I think by now Bernie has a set of stylized facts or correlations which sort of beg the question of why. You could have guessed this, right? It's a follow-up from the previous slide. I would really like this literature and Bernie and his co-author to move from the technical or mechanical level of the discussion to the more economic or fundamental approach. What does this literature on these indices actually tell us about the basic concepts of corporate governance that all of us are interested in? Can these indices or the statistically significant components of them, do we know that if they can be used for policy? By this I mean, if disclosure is correlated with some good outcome in Korea, do we know that we should, I don't know, propose to Ethiopia or Zimbabwe or some other country to adopt Korean-like disclosure policies? I think we don't know much about, although there are some studies doing sort of related things about the country level regime for which we have many indices, Andrei Schleifer and his co-authors and others, and the firm level sort of indices. How do these two interact? I think that would be interesting to know. This is the end. So the thank you to the organizers come at the end, and Stockholm is a great city. Tokyo is much more fun. So see you all next year. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to perhaps raise a slightly more fundamental question than Yishai was raising. I think you've made a very persuasive argument that there is a problem of construct validity. And the question it raises in my mind is why you are still trying therefore to create indices. I mean, to the extent that one's trying to look at relations with activities or performance within countries, they're clearly not relevant there. To the extent that it's across country, well, if it really is fixed by law within a country, it's still relevant to cross-country variations and might be relevant to cross-time variations as well. And I think one's potentially interested in the extent to which the components have different effects cross-country. So, for example, board composition may have a different effect on different elements that you're looking at in terms of firm activities or firm performance, as might shareholder disclosure requirements or shareholder right requirements. So I think you've made a very persuasive case for saying that one, at this stage, really wants to move on beyond trying to construct indices, which might have had a role in the early stages of providing sort of headline numbers, but I think missed a lot in the process.
Tom, no, I just have yeah, it's working. Okay, great. It's kind of it's more of a question, really. It's hard for me to understand what exactly a high score, a score of 1 in this index means you have a certain property, and the question is, what in the world does that mean? For instance, if I take if I take transparent disclosure as one of the properties, and then I take protection of minority shareholder rights, and suppose I score a 1 on both of those. What does that mean? The properties don't seem to be in any way connected. It's sort of like if you were evaluating a political candidate and said, well, he's for gun rights, but he's against free trade, so I give him a 1 for both of those things. Well, what's the association between the two? It's just puzzling to me.
I have so 2 questions. One is outside the scope of the paper, so it's really more an invitation to speculate. The other one might relate directly to what Bernie's doing. And it's a why Tobin's Q. I mean, the corporate governance essentially regulates the relation between the company and its equity investors. And while many things can affect Tobin's Q, the first order question of the, it would seem to me economically would be, what's the effect of these things on the cost of capital? So my question is why, if you're going to rank them, you don't rank them in terms of their direct immediate effect, which is, as I said, the cost of capital. I think the other one, which is not exactly fair in the sense that it's way beyond the scope, so it's maybe more addressed to everybody than Bernie, but companies, as everybody knows, raise a lot more money through debt than through equity. And the debt instruments regulate extensively the relationship between the firm and its debt investors. And we don't have any debt indices, which would seem to be a lot more important, or at least equally important with corporate governance indices. So I was wondering why. Maybe a next step would be, why don't we study debt indices or rank these debt contracts and see whether or not they contribute to anything meaningful.
So I want to put this work with the first paper of the morning, the institutional investor one. So what is an institutional investor going to make of this work, as opposed to, in effect, Colin's point, which is the fact that you think that if a particular governance element is required, it ought to be out of the index because you don't get any variation, goes against the idea from the institutional investor point of view that if we think the element that's required is a fundamental feature of good governance, then it becomes critical to evaluate the firm, the nation, et cetera, as to where you want to invest. So I guess the issue is why look within, within the nation state, as it were, for governance as the model, as opposed to a broader view of what counts as good governance, given that the investors here are going to be looking at the cross-national comparisons.
Okay, so a few responses. We had some skepticism about our indices useful, and can we look at individual governance elements in our language? And the answer to that is going to be, it's going to end up being really hard to get away from the role of governance indices. So sometimes you can get legal shocks, natural experiments to particular elements of governance, and those are useful and they're wonderful when you get them in particular countries, and I am delighted to exploit them when we have them. And we saw a paper from Rob Daines yesterday that tries to use a particular one, but those are narrow and limited. They're a particular experiment in a particular country. If we want to generalize, we're going to have to look beyond just the natural experiments. Once we do that, you cannot simply ask, what's the correlation between a particular element, even in a panel's data setting with firm fixed effects, and some outcome, whether it's profitability, whether it's Tobin's Q, without controlling for the rest of governance. Otherwise, you've got a huge omitted variable bias problem, because different aspects of governance do indeed correlate with each other. So you're still going to have to control for the rest of governance. And to do that, you're either going to have a bunch of individual elements, or you're going to have an index. The two are going to be close substitutes. So we're still going to have to be trying to figure out, how do we measure governance? And we don't have to pull it into an index, but that may end up being a useful thing to do. It's going to be very hard to avoid, because one of the things you can't do is just look at governance elements one at a time. The second thing that you could do is throw a bunch of elements into a single regression and see if anything predicts anything, and the answer is nothing will predict anything, right? If you look at whether any individual aspect of disclosure will predict Tobin's Q or profitability or anything else, the answer will be no, I've tried it, okay? Virtually never. What you might get power out of is by aggregating a bunch of individually unimportant disclosure elements into an index that might let you say, and indeed we find across countries, that in the aggregate, better firm level disclosure against the background of whatever country rules there are predicts higher Tobin's Q, predicts higher share price. That's interesting. It seems to be a pattern across countries. Investors seem to reward firms for providing better disclosure against the background of what the country's rules are. You then have the question is, does that have an effect on profitability? That's a different project. My answer is probably not. Probably disclosure might lead to investors paying more for the same earnings, much less likely, much less obvious what the channel is for better disclosure to actually generate higher earnings. But part of the reason why we continue to use indices is that the individual elements by themselves, if they predict something, if you ignore the rest of governance, that's an omitted variable problem. If you bring in the rest of governance, the individual elements often predict very little. Yishai asked why Q. Well, we continue to use Q in effect because for all its problems, we don't have anything that's systematically better. If we have a shock to governance, we can look at share price. If we just look at share price levels, that's what Tobin's Q is you know, in effect a variant of market to book. You got a question about why don't you look at cost of capital? Well, that's what Tobin's Q is. It's the inverse of cost of capital, at least for equity capital. So we are in fact looking at that. Some of Yishai's comments about I want you to look at the fundamentals and what matters is, yeah, and we're doing that in other projects. And this is asking, does this index make coherent sense, right? And we can't put that into a single project, I don't think. So this was our effort to take a step back and say, okay, does this building index stuff, is it coherent as best we can tell what coherence is? It's not the only thing you're going to do, but I don't see a good way of getting away from it. You're almost pushed into it because the alternatives are not very palatable either. Does country-level governance, country-level rules matter? Surely that's a different exercise, a different literature. It's not clear how you put the two together. What do I do with an audit committee in a country where it's required? How do I tell what difference it makes? Answer, I can't. I can look at the change from when it wasn't required to when it was and hope that there's variation between firms and look at that, and people have done that for individual elements. But in terms of asking whether audit committees are valuable, that's going to be a really, really hard question to answer using country-level data. It may be useful to try to ask it using firm-level data. At least that's what we've been trying to do. So Yishai asked what principal component analysis does. Sub-indices are dimension reduction. We're taking 30 or 40 elements and collapsing them into 6 aspects. Principal component analysis is a mechanical form of dimension reduction. It's coming from a different concept. It's saying, let's create eigenvectors. Let's see if the two seem to be producing different things, and that would be a sign of coherence. That's what we're trying to do, is do dimension reduction in a different way, and I agree that that wasn't clear in the paper, and we can make it so. But part of Yishai's comments, my reaction was, you're asking for work that we're trying to do in other papers, and it's still, to me, interesting to do the methods work off to the side, as it were. And the frustrating thing is how little we can say about whether these indices are good measures of what they claim to be measuring. We can make some progress, and my best sense of the construct validity literature is some is a little, not a lot. I wish it was more.